Welcome to the inaugural episode of Oregon Business Matters, a podcast by OBI focused on insights, issues, and initiatives that impact Oregonians' shared prosperity and the state's economic health. I'm your host, Angela Wilhelms, president of OBI. Today, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome a guest who has loads of insight, an uncanny ability to recall historical data, and a knack for sharing that vast knowledge in very digestible ways. John Horvick, Senior Vice President of DHM Research. John, welcome to the podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. So before we get started talking about a variety of issues here, you are, as I mentioned, the vice president at DHM Research, which is as close to a household name in Oregon as a public opinion research company can be, probably. But would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about your background and how you became involved in this business?
Sure. Quickly, just DHM, for maybe those who don't know it, we're an independent and nonpartisan public opinion and policy firm. So that, so the long way of saying that we're pollsters. And then we work with a variety of different clients. So public sector, private sector, nonprofits. I think that maybe distinguishes us from other firms is that we don't ever do work for candidates or for political parties. We work with all sorts of interests who are curious about and want to know about, how people are feeling about parties or candidates, but we don't work for the candidates or party themselves. And we work with, clients on, sometimes they, might be more whatever left and right mean these nowadays, but come from different perspectives. And we're fortunate to work on all sorts of issues: education, healthcare, transportation, taxes and government spending, all that sort of stuff. And then for me, how did I get here? I studied sociology in undergraduate with really an emphasis on research design, methods, stats, that sort of stuff. And then I spent most of my college days at the University of Nebraska, and then I'm from Minnesota. In my last 3 semesters, I spent at the University of Minnesota. That's where my diploma is, although my sports loyalties are very much to the Big Red.
And we'll have to talk about that in a different episode, I think.
We're Big Ten rivals now, with us and the Ducks. And then I immediately went to grad school, and I went to grad school back at Nebraska. And, many people succeed and thrive going from undergraduate to grad, and gosh, I didn't. And although I did well academically, I got good grades, when it came to determining what was important to study and research and, work on a thesis on, I was just totally lost. I think not having that exposure to, life made me sort of unaware of what was the important questions to ask. And that was at sort of point in my life I wanted to do something different. I'd grown up in the Midwest, gone to school in the Midwest, and wanted to do something different. So packed up the car and headed west, and ended up in Portland. It's not exactly like throwing at a dart at a map, but not so different. I had never visited here, didn't know folks here, but got on the internet and looked at best places to live, and Portland, for me, kept on showing up. And I immediately, or pretty soon after I got here, got working at a position at OHSU in the School of Nursing, supporting some research projects up there, particularly with some issues around ADHD, which is not my expertise, but I had some expertise in managing research studies. That's sort of where I fit. But the important thing was that I had some bosses there who were supportive of me beyond the 9 to 5. She really wanted to support me getting involved with the community, particularly being here in town new. And to the extent that I had a particular interest in graduate school, it rose around these ideas of social capital. And for those who might know, there's a researcher by the name of Robert Putnam. He wrote a famous book called Bowling Alone, which is about social connections, not about bowling, but about social connections and being involved in civic organizations and how that can be supportive or helpful for communities to thrive. And anyway, he came to speak at an event at City Club of Portland. I went to that event, not because I had any particular interest in City Club, I don't think I knew what it was. But lots of people were there, hundreds of people were at that event, and I really thought this is the place for me. And I got very involved with City Club, produced a lot of events, whether there were speakers or, tours of civic places or, studying public policy issues and research sort of committees that the club does. And then I think being young at that time and being willing to show up and do work and raise my hand when asked was very attractive to more seasoned members in leadership, and they wanted to encourage young people to be engaged. And I was fortunate to be asked to serve on the board. And I ended up serving on the board a few times. And over my time at the club, served as president. But early days, one of my fellow board members was Adam Davis, the D of DHM. And one day he was just talking to somebody I was overhearing, saying he was going to do a focus group. And I don't know exactly why I asked if I could come and watch. It's one of those moments, like if I wasn't standing by him and didn't have the gumption to ask, I don't know how my life would have, what sort of other directions it would have gone.
Well, yeah.
But he said that I could, and I did. And it happened to be a focus group about the big look. If you remember, about 2008.
Land
use planning. Yeah. And then Adam went to the focus group, and Adam, bless him, he asked if I could write a memo for it, and I did. And then that quickly turned into work, and then quickly became a full-time job. And so it was a combination of like being a little lost, but showing up at places where I found people that shared my interests, and raising my hand and making some connections with people, and doing work that I found interesting, and I landed there, and that's it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we are certainly glad that you have. We enjoy learning a lot from your insights. But so it sounds like if you joined DHM in 2008, it's been 17 years, and I imagine a lot's changed in the industry in that time. Can you talk a little bit about how it's morphed, just the business of public opinion research?
The big changes have really been on our availability to reach people using some of the traditional tools that existed certainly when I started. And most survey research, even today, uses the telephone as the medium to reach. And now we have some different ways we can use the telephone to reach people, but certainly when I was starting, it was primarily live interview phone. I mean, there was some other things, but it was almost exclusively live interview phone calls. A few things have happened. Some of this is sort of ancient history now, but one of the big things was the transition from utilization of landlines to cell phones. And people used to pay per minute for a cell phone, even for inbound calls. So people would be reluctant if they had a cell phone to pick up the phone. And then with that came caller ID, and people became reluctant to pick up phone calls from people who they didn't know. And so there's more screening. And then telemarketing really took off sort of in that kind of late 90s to early 2000 periods. And so people were getting more phone calls, and just became harder to reach people. So response rates dropped. And so one of the big changes is just like, if response rates drop, so if fewer people you call are answering the phone, you have to call more people to get a person on the phone. There's a cost associated with that. And so prices went up. The other is that you have to start questioning, can we still get a good sample? Can we still reach people who are representing the community and ask the questions that we need to? So over the years, the big change has been adoption of multiple ways to reach people. So most projects will do nowadays use a combination of different tools. And we still do some live interview phone calls. It's still a good way to reach some people, but more and more people expect to be reached sort of on their own time, and that usually means by text message. And so we do a lot of text messaging now. And that doesn't mean it's not that the interview is conducted via text message, but you send someone a text message with a link, and that link will take them to a survey that they can take online on their smartphone, or they can send it to another device of their preference. And then one thing that's really changed is we're much better at reaching people online than we used to. We could talk about it, but kind of a longer conversation how we do that, but we are able to do it. And so most projects now, rather than being sole method, relying on the telephone, they're blended methodologies, each with their strengths and weaknesses, and then figuring out how to put these together to make a successful project based upon what your research questions are and you're trying to reach. That piece is sort of always evolving and evolving, faster and faster. So the next month we might have a new tool, or something else might stress us a little bit, but that pace has changed. The piece that hasn't changed as much, it's changed a little bit, but it's the qualitative side. So I actually do a lot of my work is not survey research, but focus group research. So I spend a lot of my time traveling the state, sitting at the table with folks and having conversations about their communities. And that face-to-face interaction, technology can do some things to supplement that, but But there is nothing quite the same as putting neighbors together and having a conversation about the place they live. And we still do a lot of that. I'll be in Prineville this weekend, talking to folks about issues in their community.
That makes a lot of sense. And that, like you said, that human to human interaction where they can interact among themselves and with you to facilitate that qualitative research. That's got to be fascinating. You must learn so much in these different communities. So let's switch a little bit then to some of what you're learning since you started doing this work. Aside from the process changes, what have you seen change over time in how Oregonians think or what they think or what their expectations are for their communities and the state as a whole? How has that shifted over time?
Well, a few big things jump into my mind immediately, and two are somewhat related, and that's the polarization that has occurred. The polarization you can measure, you can see it in different ways, and you can measure it in different ways. But the two big things are ideological polarization, I should say, like not even so much ideological, but party polarization. And just to give you some examples, the classic question that pollsters love to ask is, all things considered, is Oregon or Portland or United States, whatever sort of you're looking at, head in the right direction, or is it off on the wrong track? And because DHM has been in business since 1977, our archives goes back a long ways. And if you go up until about 2007, 8, 9, in that period, and you ask this question, things head in the right direction, are they off on the wrong track? There's ups and downs, but Democrats and Republicans hung together. That is like, when things are going well, Democrats said they're going well, and so did Republicans. If things are going poorly, you'd see D's and R's respond similarly. And then you get to that period, 7, 8, 9, and there's this explosion of difference where really in Oregon, Democrats became more positive and Republicans became much more sour. Non-affiliated voters somewhat in between. They tend to lean a little bit more towards Republicans in this question than Democrats. All of that depends on the moment you're in. And, you could look at that period and like, why did it happen then? And I don't have the answer, but some things that really stand out is the Great Recession happens. There's a big economic disturbance. Barack Obama was elected, and that was an historic election for lots of different ways. It was really where kind of social media took off. It's like Twitter and especially sort of took off. And then the iPhone came out, and this having that smartphone with social media in your pocket all the time. I mean, these are all things that sort of coincided with that period of sort of D's and R's going apart. So that's one big change. Another big change related is just the geographic polarization. You go back to really almost the entire century from the 1920s to the 1980s, and you take the most Democratic county compared to the least Democratic county in presidential elections. It would typically be about 20 to 25 percentage points apart. And then you just see this inflection point in the 1980s, and it just arises and rises and rises. And now the most Democratic and least Democratic counties are about 60, 65 percentage points apart. So, and then there's education polarization as well. But these are there's just these big trends that have moved to push politics further, like our D's and R's, or conservative liberals, or urban, rural, educated, not educated, just further and further apart from each other. I mean, it makes it really difficult to talk about how today's politics compare to the past, because this world is just so different than the past. But that's a big one, or those are two big ones. And then the other is just the issues have changed. It was until about 2017, 2018. I would give presentations where I'd just say, the top issues in Oregon are education and jobs and the economy. And it's only a question of which one is on top. When the economy is doing well, education tends to be the most important issue. When the economy is not doing as well, education falls to number 2, and so jobs and economy jumps to number 1. Now it's just, we've been so overwhelmed by homelessness the last 5 or 6 years. It's really remarkable. So if you ask people today, like, tell us the most important problem facing the state, and we might get 40-45% of Oregonians think it's homelessness. In contrast, like during the height of the Great Depression, or excuse me, the Great Recession, about 20 to 25 people would say jobs in the economy. So even at a sort of peak economic stress, there are fewer people mentioning economic issues as the most important problem than have been saying homelessness now. So that issue, and homelessness is like a lot of things. It's obviously people living on the streets without shelter. It's also a sense of disorder and chaos on the streets. It's, people's perceptions of mental illness and drugs and crime. So it's a lot of things.
Yeah.
But it
I
is
gotta think the cost of housing fits in there somewhere too. And
sure,
yeah.
sure. Yes. It's remarkable both with its intensity and just it being new. It just wasn't something that was on the radar. You go back to the late teens. So those are some of the big things that come to my mind.
All right. Well, let's stick with housing for a second because I think this is interesting. I've seen some of the polling work that you've done and that others have done where it is remarkably consistent as far as the top issue among different demographics, different political segments, et cetera, housing and homelessness as a key issue. What I've also found interesting, and I'd love to hear your reactions to, are that this does seem to be one area where that polarization breaks down a little bit in that Republican, Democrat, rural, urban, et cetera, everyone wants the government focused on this solution, and they almost don't even care deeply what the solutions are. They just want solutions. They just want action. And that strikes me as different than maybe, let's say, how people might want to fund, I don't know, transportation or any other program. Are you seeing that? Like that it's almost like this weird unification around just get the work done, people.
There is that. I would also say, so you might then say, well, if everybody's in agreement, this is a problem, and everybody's in agreement that we want to move with urgency towards solutions, that then there should be a clear path forward. And that's true. And then here's where the pollster is going to say, but there's lots of buts to this, but the one that stands out to me is that in all the polling that we've done, and people who are going to come to different conclusions about this. So this is my take, though. All the polling we've done is that Oregonians just broadly do not believe in supply and demand when it comes to housing. At least they maybe believe it in an abstract, in a macro sense, but they don't believe it in a more local sense. And I just like to give you some examples. If we ask Oregonians, you think Oregon has enough housing or not, and they'll say overwhelmingly we don't have enough housing. But then you ask questions like, if more housing was built in your neighborhood, what sort of impacts would that have? And they'll say, well, it's going to drive up costs. And then you'll ask, well, what sort of impacts can it have you personally? Well, it's going to make my satisfaction, my quality of life decline. And it's hard to square these things where people think both, yes, we have too little housing, which to me suggests that they think that there's a connection between housing and supply. But if you build supply next to me, that's going to drive up costs. And also it's sort of strange, if you build supply next to me, it's going to drive up costs, but also it's going to make my neighborhood less desirable.
Yeah.
It's in my mind, it's if a neighborhood is less desirable, it should be less valuable, but that's not the way people sort of respond to these questions. And so yes, people want more housing. Where they want it, the type of housing matters a lot. And a lot of people are just really skeptical about adding more housing to their own immediate neighborhood and the sorts of effects that they believe it might have on them, which it makes, if you multiply that across the state, and it's really difficult to get that housing built.
Yeah, no, those are really good insights. That's why we rely on you guys to help us sift through not just layers of data in any given research project, but as you've mentioned, an archive of data where you can kind of draw back from. I want to go back to something you were talking about earlier, which is, again, the polarization. And I found this interesting. You recently posted on X about gubernatorial approval ratings. Specifically, you were talking about a research project that showed how the most popular governor is a Republican in a state won by Vice President Harris, and the most popular Democratic governors are in states won by Trump. So what do you think accounts for this, and why maybe is that? I don't know if that's different than what we're seeing in Oregon, but it sounds a little incongruent, at least with what we're seeing in Oregon.
Sure. Well, if you look at national polls, Tina Kotek or before her, Kate Brown, were had some of the least favorable ratings of any governor in the country. And you might say, well, these are Democrats in Democratic states. You think they'd be popular just on that basis. And and they haven't been. I mean, so there's some that are idiosyncratic. Like you take Kentucky, where you have Andy Beshear, a Democrat in a red state, and he is a yeah, he's a sort of favorite son in the state. His family is a long-term political family in the state and long-term Democrats in the state. So not to say that. Well, there's just he has some individual characteristics about him that aren't replicable with necessarily with other leaders. You look at Phil Scott, the Republican in Vermont. He's been governor there for about 10 years. They do elections every 2 years, which I'm not sure if that plays anything into it, but maybe there's something about having to be held more accountable on a shorter time base that makes you act differently. And then you have the governor from a Democratic governor in Kansas, another sort of popular Democrat and Republican state. Part of you take all three of these. I'm not an expert necessarily in Kansas, Vermont, or Kentucky politics, but they're all states also with opposite party legislators. Maybe there's just something that voters really value about. You pick your word, but the one that comes to my mind is balance. These competing forces keep the states from getting too far away from where the public wants it to be. That probably plays a big role in it. The other is that they're all fairly weak governors from a political science sense of the word, but also because they have opposite party majorities in the legislature. They're constrained about how far they can go. And again, I'm not the expert in everything that these governors do or about politics in their state, but those dynamics are going to set up where there's an opportunity to cool things before they get too hot for the public. And I suspect that has a lot. When Maryland until recently had a Republican governor, and he was quite popular too. Again, a Republican governor in a blue state. So I do think that there's something about it. And there's also just something the fact that these must be talented politicians. I mean, these are politicians who won counter to the state's majority politics. So there must be something particularly skilled about these individuals to be able to even been in a position to win those statewide elections.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Let's switch from direct electoral politics for a bit. Another thing that you posted about recently was consumer sentiment, which is measured frequently and a topic of great concern, especially to those of us who work with and represent the business community. What are you seeing when you look at the research out there nationally and here in Oregon about consumer sentiment?
Well, certainly headed down compared to where we were a couple months ago, but and that's people obviously very interested in where we are at this moment. I would encourage people to really, this moment matters, right? This is where people are making decisions. But looking back, how do we interpret these numbers? Like we were saying before about polarization, whether it's right direction, wrong track, or geographic or education, we see these big polarization, polarized responses to questions about the economy. Sort of put that in air quotes, the economy, where, up until, Biden left office, Democrats were really ecstatic about the economy, Republicans really sour. And then if you see a chart, the lines just switch, right around Inauguration Day, where Republicans are quite positive, although even they are waning right now, and Democrats quite sour. And some of that is people's projections about what policies they're going to deliver. So, Democrats aren't excited about the president's policies, and Republicans weren't excited about Biden's policies, and then made some interpretations about the economy from that. And on the one hand, that's kind of, people can answer these questions any way they want, but it does make it pretty difficult to compare what people are saying about the economy today to the past, because you didn't see these big partisan differences in the past. And so if you're trying to make these apples to apples comparisons, 2025 to say 2000 is harder to do. One of the things that we've been doing more in our own research, and we certainly ask people how they feel about, Oregon's economic conditions, for example, and we will continue to do that. I mean, it's good to check in, and we certainly want to have those historical comparisons. But I prefer to ask questions around how people are feeling about their personal finances. People tend to, one, be more positive, which isn't necessarily a goal, but if you ask people how they're doing personally, they tend to say that they're doing better personally than the economy is doing. And, my goal is not to strip away partisan differences, but you see much smaller partisan differences when you ask people how they're doing personally than, how they rate the economy. And I think it's probably a better metric on how things are going out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. They're
Uh,
not imparting some of that macro political sentiment
yeah,
into how they think they should be answering. It's really about themselves.
yeah,
Your use of metaphorical quotes around the economy reminds me of that insurance commercial that's out there right now, where the kid goes to the kitchen island and asks a group of adults what the economy is, and they stumble around trying to answer, and he finally is like, "Fine, I'll just go look it up on the internet."
yeah.
um,
I think right now people are saying the economy is who's the president of the United States.
Yeah, that's an interesting not just correlation, but yeah, people really are assigning the economy more to the people or the party or the person or whatever in charge of whatever it is they're analyzing. That's fascinating. Um we could go on all day. I want to just get a couple more questions in here because I think people listening are probably really interested in a wide variety of topics, which we don't have time to cover them all, but really interested in how the work is done and how you guys think about it. So, what are some trends you see that listeners might find surprising?
I think a lot about the state's demographics. One that some demographics that I often show in my presentations that often gets people to sit up is that they are often unaware of how diverse rural Oregon is. And if you look at some racial diversity, some of our most diverse counties are in Eastern Oregon, Malheur County, Morrow County, Jefferson County. Of course, if you look at the number of people of color, for example, you're going to have the most people in places like Washington or Marion County or Multnomah County. But some of our rural places are becoming increasingly diverse, and some of our rural places are young. There's places in the state that are like Curry County its median age is, I don't know, something like 20 years older than say the median age of Umatilla County. But so one of the trends I'm just sort of thinking about a lot is, how does this play out in the future? So you take like Curry County, which I can't remember the median age off my head, but it is about 20 years more than say Umatilla County, and so but they both vote red, they both vote Republican. And how does the Republican coalition hold together when you need to think about the needs of a community that's going to be quite focused on sort of retirement and long-term care and the needs of an aging community, and one that has a rapidly changing, racially diversifying, young, largely Hispanic population in a fairly rural, more remote part of the state. And I don't have answers to those questions, but these are that's like a big trend that I'm paying a lot of attention to. And another trend I'm paying a lot of attention to is that we're getting older. And this is not an Oregon specific thing, although Oregon is relatively old compared to the rest of the country. That manifests itself in all sorts of ways. Like if you look at the typical voter, say in a primary election, your modal voter, so the sort of age that's most typical, it's about 67 years old. And there's nothing wrong with being 67 years old at all, or being a frequent, being a consistent voter if you're pushing that age. But it's going to necessarily have an effect on things like, your local school levy or your school bond or investments for healthcare. Some of these big trends that we've been talking for a while are really sort of coming up against us, and they're going to affect sort of resource allocations. They're going to affect the issues that politicians cater towards because of who turns out to vote and what their needs are. And there are don't expect things to stay the same. These demographic forces are really important to how we organize and what we prioritize and how we vote. And
It's fascinating to think about how the communities are changing, and maybe how I think you've done a nice job pointing out what might be some traditional stereotypes people might make, and how really looking at the data can help you understand whether that stereotype's rooted in assumption or fact, and what that means for policymaking. I think that's critical for us all to keep in mind. Well, as I mentioned, we could go on probably for multiple episodes, but we promised our listeners a relatively short form podcast. So I'm going to ask you if we can just invite you back for future episodes, because I have a feeling there's a lot people are going to want to hear from you and the others at DHM Research over time. But one last question. I just want to leave you a chance to let us know if there is any sort of common misconception or just any other thing about the work that you do, about public opinion research, quantitative or qualitative, that you'd like to make sure people understand, or something that you think, maybe is a misconception out there?
I'll try rather than sort of be negative about it.
Yeah,
I'll try
sorry.
to be
I thought of it.
positive.
That's why I was stumbling over the question. I was like, I really should flip that around. So please
So
do.
one of the criticisms with pollsters we'll get a lot is like how you can get any answer you want if you just ask the question that's in a particular way, and that's not really true. At the same time, it's not without anything behind it. Like the words you use to frame an issue are going to make a difference. And what I would encourage, like consumers of public opinion, is to, rather than like dismiss things when they see things framed in a way that is different than the way that they would frame it themselves, is seize an opportunity to learn about and be curious about the different ways people might encounter an issue or think about an issue or form an opinion about an issue when it's framed in different ways. If you ask a question in a positive way, you might get a response. If you ask a similar question but framed in a negative way, you make another response. And rather than one necessarily being absolutely right or absolutely wrong, you can think about, well, both from like a strategic or a tactical point, if you're involved with politics, like what do you want to do with that information? But just as a casual observer, to be aware that people's opinions about public policy are often held fairly lightly, and that it's interesting to think about how people might think about an issue different ways if they're framed up differently. So that'd be the thing, rather than sort of like, and not everybody does this, of course, but what some people do, rather than encountering that stuff with a real sort of criticism, see it as an opportunity to think about, that's curious about why people might respond differently if it's framed that way.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that way of thinking. Thank you for flipping that on its head for me. And let everybody know how they can follow you to stay up to date on some of those posts that I mentioned and other insights that you share.
Of course, you can go to DHM's website, dhmresearch.com. We do a lot of our own research, and we post a lot of our own research on our website. It's under a link called Insights, but if you just go to dhmresearch.com, you'll find it. You can find me on X, I guess we call it nowadays, at Horvick. And then you can find me on Blue Sky too, and it's whatever the Horvick, whatever the Blue Sky handles are. But if you Google or Blue Sky or whatever the word is, Horvick, you'll find me there too. And I try to post things both places. Those audiences have split, but I want to communicate to both, so I'm usually in both places.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, John Horvick from DHM Research. It is always fascinating to visit with you, and we look forward to having you back on the podcast in the future.
Thank you so much.
Listeners, thank you for tuning in to Oregon Business Matters. Please visit OregonBusinessIndustry.com for more information, and be well.